Welcome to Spirit at Work. Today our guest is Reverend John Schluep, who is the senior pastor of the First Congregational Church of Talmadge. Glad to have you here today, John.
Thank you. Nice to be here and be on the show.
Right away, in terms of our show, this is the first time, besides myself, we've had an ordained minister. Tell us a little bit about what led you down that path.
The path to ordination?
Yes.
Well, it was a call from God, and how people define the call or understand the call, I think, is individual and personal. Of course, you have to articulate that call and discernment in front of a board of clergy as well as lay people within the church. I was first ordained in the United Methodist Church. Prior to answering the call to ministry, I was in the Army, served 4.5 years as an infantry officer, and felt some uneasiness and I wouldn't say dissatisfaction, but prayed about it and wasn't particularly religious at the time, was not attending regularly any church or services of worship, and felt this nudging, this call, this pull in my life. Talked it over with my wife. She was pregnant with our first child, so it's been a long, long time ago. And when I was home on leave, spoke with Charles Hill, a United Methodist pastor from my hometown in Hilliard, Ohio. And seemed like the discernment process was in motion. And spent more time thinking about it and praying about it, and decided to resign my commission and enter into seminary. Having very little knowledge of Scripture, very little knowledge of religious institutions, but here I am.
I guess I want to ask you, within that call, what was it when you saw yourself being a minister? Specifically, was there a particular focus you had in that ministry, or strong sense of, gosh, I've been in war or I've been in the service and want to come from another direction or foster peace? Any particularities around that?
I didn't have any sense of that at that age.
Yes.
I was 26, 27 years old. It just seemed like the right thing to do at the time. It felt right for me, and had the support of my wife and both families, my family of origin, her family of origin. I think as I look back, and of course hindsight's 20/20, I think the gifts that I bring to ministry is leadership. I find oftentimes the same leadership principles that I was trained in, brought up with in the Army. I was an infantry officer, I think I mentioned that. I served in combat ready units at the end of Vietnam, so I'm a Vietnam era veteran. So it just seemed like it was a natural transition for me to lead congregations, the same leadership principles that would lead a rifle platoon or a rifle company.
What would be the correlation between your service as an infantry officer and now your service as pastor in leadership? Where do you see the correlation? Or you mentioned certain basic leadership principles that you experienced at work in both areas.
Yeah.
What might those be?
I think part of it has to do with taking care of people, looking out for people, answering a higher calling. When you're in the Army, orders come from on high.
Yeah.
And you may have questions about those orders, but you follow them. The responsibility of taking care of people, as I mentioned, but also the leadership principles of being responsible and accountable for everything that my people do or fail to do. It's a tremendous leadership burden as well as a responsibility, and I see those same principles. Also, people are called towards conviction. People will follow conviction. If you believe in what you're doing, and you can articulate that, and you have that gift to lead, I think that happens. The other part of that principle of leadership is people are not going to follow until they know how much you care about them, deeply care. And to me, that has to be a tremendous sincerity on your part. It has to be genuine, has to be sincere, because people feel that, they sense that at a very deep spiritual level. And I think that's true whether it's an infantry company or whether it's a local congregation or any type of business or organization where there's a leadership requirement.
Yeah. For those who might associate that word call with being a priest or a minister, pastor, what might you say to the rest of us who might be in that secular world, who are struggling with what does that really mean? How do you know whether you're being called? And as a lawyer, do I have a call? Or as a businessman or woman, do I have a call?
Yeah, that's a good question. The word vocation comes from the same word of voice, of hearing a voice. I think there are needs within our world, needs within our local community, and you have been endowed with certain gifts and talents. And the Creator wants you to use those gifts to serve the community. And so when the community needs intersect with your understanding of your gifts and talents, then you have a vocational calling. You have a purpose and meaning for existence, and the desire to give to the community, to serve a higher calling, is of utmost importance. If you remember if we diminish that, we draw humanity out of the person. We really deplete them and diminish them. One of the metaphors that I use for that is the incredible shrinking man. The film from 1953, and he passes through an atomic mist, and then he begins to shrink in size and stature. And as he becomes smaller, as he becomes diminished in size, he becomes more and more combative with the woman that he loves, and she loves him. And if we remember that story, he does become more combative as he is diminished. And I believe that in our work area, in our communities, when we diminish people, when we do not let them or allow them to live out that calling, we diminish them. And that may be part of the combative nature sometimes within our communities that I just think manifests in a lot of different ways, very damaging ways. To answer the call, to have that affirmed, it inspires us. It's the motivation to get up and do what we have to do every day, to work tirelessly for things. So I think the call to ministry, the call to be an attorney, the call to be a grocery store manager, the call to be a postal delivery person, be a good one. Be a good one. Do it with a sincere heart. Do it with an open heart, and see how you serve the needs of the community that way.
John, I know, married, 3 children. As they were growing up, you were in ministry. Lots of folks in a lot of different areas of occupations question, how do I get a sense of balance in my life? So many things pull at me in many directions. How was that for you in ministry and as a family man?
Well, it's very difficult. I think my family stabilizes me. I have that safe port to come home to at night. And sometimes that port gets interrupted with phone calls or needs of the people. My family understands that, and they support that. I find a balance in I know when I'm getting out of balance. I begin to forget appointments. There's a lot of things that you start to lose sleep, and to me that's a signal to me you need to back off. Your body's telling you something here. The spirit is telling you. You need to take a break. And I step back. My congregation understands that. They give me the time off. They expect me to take time off. Find that balance of body, mind, and spirit. And sometimes you just have to be selfish and say, this is my time. I'm going to turn the telephone off. I'm not answering it. I'm not going to turn the television on. I have a way of just getting away for different times of the year and going on a personal spiritual retreat Sometimes it's with a band of brothers and sisters, and other times it's just solo by myself. My wife and I try to carve out enough time for us as husband and wife to be friends and maintain that friendship as husband and wife. 36 years of marriage. We've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, and we're sticking together. So she helps me find my balance. I think the spiritual dimension as well. Knowing in my heart of the Christ presence and what I'm asked to do or called to do is not beyond my capabilities and capacity to function. So
that's good. Thanks.
What would you recommend leaders in that regard, insofar as what they might say or what kind of climate they may foster in the workplaces or in the professional communities where they work to promote health and wellness in balance? Where might we be missing the mark, so to speak?
Well, I don't know that we're all missing the mark. I think a lot of it is our acculturation process. We are extremely competitive. We have so many ways to be accessible to people, whether it's Facebook or telephones or texting, the cell phones. There's a need for privacy. I think we need to honor that in people. We need to honor that sacred space within each person. And in my opinion, if we can make things a sacred space, it becomes very crucial. It becomes that sanctuary for us.
Gee, thank you very much for being part of this first segment. We'll be coming back right after this for our second segment. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this segment of Spirit Alive. Today our guest is Reverend John Schluep, and we're glad to have him here as he's sharing some of his life and ministry, and ask Larry to jump into this segment with a question.
John, we know that as a result of your experience as a veteran yourself and as pastor, that you've been very active, and the community's been very appreciative of your work with veterans.
Thank you.
Can you tell us generally about the work you're doing with veterans?
Yeah, it's hard for me to discern sometimes what is self-serving and what is serving the community, and I think we can do both of those things very well sometimes. I think it's important to know where you are in that whole process. Being a veteran, once you're a veteran, you're always a different person. You've been changed through basic training, through advanced training, through your experiences in the military, and certainly a war experience changes us. It shakes the psychic ground that we build our lives on. And 8 or 9 years ago, I had a Vietnam combat veteran come to my office on a recommendation of his VA psychiatrist. And the issue that the psychiatrist identified was that his issue was between him and God. And he had lost all faith in God and lost faith in the institutions that he felt at the age of 19 he was called to protect and defend. And however we understand that, to protect U.S. interests abroad. 35 years later, he is still struggling with the demons from what he did in war and what was done to him, what he witnessed. When he left my office, I was filled with a deep sense of grief. I told him I couldn't do anything to help him except walk with him through this, because I didn't know what to do. From that time, I began to research post-traumatic stress disorder from war experience, from being in the military, understanding through my research that for the Army and the Marine Corps especially, it's more operant conditioning, like Pavlov's dog, than it is about training. The training is an important component of it. But the conditioning is also important because it will save your life or save the life of someone else in a combat situation. The work with the veterans, the genesis was started with that interview with that man who was just slightly older than me, and I thought, there but for the grace of God go I. I'm a Vietnam era veteran, and there's a few things that are difficult to understand. That being an era veteran and not serving in a war zone, you carry a certain sense of guilt. Not that you did anything wrong, it's just by chance, but the veterans who have been in combat have talked me through those issues that I had. So there's been healing in my life with that. I read War and the Soul, a book by Dr. Ed Tick, which was just fresh off the shelves. The ink wasn't even dry on the pages, and I was absorbed by that book because what Dr. Tick was able to articulate was the connection between the soul and warfare. And warfare is a tremendous, intimate relationship between people. It's an inverted kind of intimacy. And to take another person's life or to be around that carnage when it takes place, it reorders our life, reorders our priorities. It shakes us up, and there's no way we can prepare people for that. There's a soul loss. There's a soul wound. And through this ministry of healing is how we restore the soul. And we have a ministry called Warrior's Journey Home Ministry, Listen, Speak, Heal. And the first thing we have to do is learn to listen. And it becomes a community's responsibility to do that, not the individual. And we don't let the VA say, well, this is your job, or the Army, this is your job. You have to do this. And those are all fine institutions, and they do very well, and they've had much progress. But until it becomes the grassroots community responsibility, I think we're going to continue to see increases in violence, increases in drug and alcohol abuse, increases in a lot of things that are that I tend to normalize as an outcome. What do you expect? Someone who's been in the trauma of war. From that, reading the book, I began research. I took a 3-month sabbatical and interviewed veterans that I served with who were combat veterans in Vietnam. Started with a small group of about 6 veterans. We sat around tables and talked, told our war stories and lies, as we like to say. Began to include civilians, the people we call who are of strong heart, because they need to learn how to listen. When you serve in the military, you serve to protect the people. And there's a warrior's code that goes along with that. That's not about making war, it's about protecting people. On Sunday evening, when we meet with our veterans group, and our civilians are a part of that. If we have 40 people, half of that group will be civilians or people of strong heart. Of the 20 who are veterans, at least 2/3 are combat veterans. The other third will be like myself, who are trained but never utilized in that capacity. The healing takes place through sacred ceremony, through prayer, through allowing them to speak their truth without interruption. I have a book called Soul's Cry, and in that book I talk about the healing presence of Jesus of Nazareth and how he restored people to community by listening to their story, by hearing their story. The 9th chapter of John's Gospel is about the man born blind. And we see from that healing story a lot of issues that are very relevant for us today, in any time and place. And the reaction of the community to the man who was born blind, why they thought he was blind to begin with, and their reaction after he found healing. It changes everything. It changed him. It changed his parents. It changed the community from which he came from. It challenged the religious authorities of his hometown. He practiced the ritual and ceremony that was a custom of his people. And they still question where the healing came from. So when we have our veterans who we have a treatment model, which is the medical model of treatment, which is fine and very effective, that does not address the soul wound of the individual. Siegfried Sassoon, the World War I veteran and poet, he said that in the trenches he saw Christ, but not with a crown of thorns. He saw Christ in a woolen soldier's cap in the muck. And what he articulates with that poem is the spiritual side of warfare. That even God is present in that mayhem, in that carnage. Yeah. And how do we restore our soul? How do we do that work? And it's hard work. It's very difficult work, as anyone will tell you. But
I know that you recently went with a group of people to Vietnam.
Yes.
Who had been there. Just any particular experience you want to share there, how that affected people who had been in Nam years ago and went back, or how it affected yourself?
It's affected us in many ways, and it's continuing to be realized what effect that had on us. One of the surprises I've experienced is how it began to heal the entire community. When we departed on September 29th for Vietnam, about 75 people from the city of Talmadge and beyond were at my church to send us off, people I'd never seen before. When we returned 3 weeks later, there were 300 at the Akron-Canton airport, and people from a great distance came who had some connection with Vietnam, either a brother or a son who had served in Vietnam or who died in Vietnam or died as a result of Agent Orange exposure, came and they felt some sense of balancing the scales, some stability in their life now, that they got some closure, because these guys had never been welcomed home, and they felt an obligation to do that. The power of the Holy Spirit is so great, moving through us, through these things.
My wife lost her brother in Vietnam in 1970. I was wondering, John, what service might be provided to families of those veterans who lost their lives during the war?
Well, I can only tell you from my experience and what we've done through this specialized ministry. We do ceremony, a sacred ceremony, and pray on behalf of that departed soul, and to bring peace and reconciliation to their life. We pray for our enemies. We ask for forgiveness for making widows, for making orphans. We ask for forgiveness for the harm and damage that we did. We met on a battlefield, and we pray that we were honorable in our fight. And somebody had to lose a life, and the life was lost. In being in Vietnam, we took dog tags from, it would be persons like yourself and your wife, who gave us information about the brother or the son. And we had dog tags made up, and we went to those battlegrounds and we offered prayer. If we look at the creation stories, the Cain and Abel story, when Abel dies, the earth absorbs his blood. And God says to Cain, I hear the earth crying out. Maybe not in so many words, I'm doing some editing here, but nature cries out with the blood that was spilled. And we need to honor that.
Well, John, thank you. Your ministry is obviously honoring that and helping all of us in the community to honor that. And certainly the reminder that faith and spirituality is a very important foundation for that.
Yes.
We're concluding this segment. Larry and I will be back in a couple moments to share some final reflections. Welcome back to our closing segment, in which Larry and I offer a couple reflections upon what we've heard from our guest. Right away, I can say I was very deeply struck that when John mentioned the notion of a wound of the soul and how important it is, and I guess I've realized that on one level, but he gave it to me on a deeper level, that whether it's war or just other things that human beings go through, that we do have to look and recognize it's not just enough for the medical community to do what they do, which is important, but as he said, hey, folks are coming back deeply grieved, deeply hurt, that soul wound that needs a spiritual response, a ministry to the whole person, including the soul. And I think too often, even in other situations, that gets neglected today.
And I was touched by that too, Norm. We've all been wounded in some kind of way, and without comparing my experience at all to the horror that some of the veterans have witnessed and been in the midst of, I know it was necessary for me to get plucked out of the busyness of my professional life, and maybe it took a health crisis to do that, but I had to really go deeper and take a look. Where have I been wounded? Where do I need reconciliation? And where do I need to re-enter the community with a sense of service? And I think that healing is the beginning of that, as John said so well. Healing may well be at the core of real community service, where we can recognize the woundedness out there in community.
Thank you again for joining us for this program, and certainly all of us can take a deeper look at our own wounds, where we need healing, and how we can be wounded healers for the sake of others.